You've probably heard the word Machiavellian thrown around, right? It usually means scheming, backstabbing, a leader who thinks the ends justify the means. But is that really the whole story? Was Niccolò Machiavelli some kind of evil genius? Or was he a deeply misunderstood patriot, writing the ultimate survival guide for leaders in a very dangerous world? Let's peel back the layers and find out. It's quotes like this one that have cemented his dark reputation for centuries. It is shocking, it's brutally pragmatic, and it really cuts to the heart of what he's all about. But to really get it, we need to understand the man and the absolutely chaotic world that shaped him. So, in this explainer, we're going to tear down 500 years of myth-making. We'll start with the man himself, then we'll break down his most infamous rules on power. We're going to dive into his ideas on public image, the role of luck, and then finally we'll uncover this desperate patriotic plea at the very end of his notorious little book. All right, so before we can even begin to understand the book, we have to understand the man, a high-flying diplomat whose entire world came crashing down around him. See, Machiavelli wasn't some academic sitting in an ivory tower. No way. For almost 15 years, he was a top diplomat for the Florentine Republic, negotiating with kings and popes. But in 1512, everything imploded. The powerful Medici family came back to power. The Republic collapsed, and Machiavelli, he was thrown out of his job, accused of conspiracy, and brutally tortured. It was from this absolute rock bottom that he wrote The Prince. So you have this popular myth of an evil genius, a teacher of tyrants. But the reality is so much more compelling. This was a man who had seen the absolute heights of power and the crushing depths of despair. He wrote The Prince not to promote evil, but to figure out what actually works. You could almost see it as a desperate job application, dedicated to the new Medici rulers, meant to prove he still had crucial knowledge to offer about how states are won and, maybe more importantly, why they're lost. And now for the advice that made him so infamous. Machiavelli's playbook is brutally realistic, starting with something very practical: how to take and hold a brand new territory. The logic here is just cold and unsentimental. To hold a new state, he says, you first have to eliminate the old bloodline. Why? To prevent a rallying point for rebellion. Then, you've got to move there yourself. Being on site means you can stamp out problems before they get out of hand. Sending your own people as colonists creates loyal footholds. And finally, you play power politics. Weaken the strong, befriend the weak, and make sure no other foreign power gets a foothold. For him, this wasn't evil. It was just the pattern he saw in every successful ruler. And this leads to one of his absolute core principles. A prince cannot outsource his own security. He argues mercenaries are worthless. They fight for money, not for loyalty, and they will betray you for a better offer in a heartbeat. And borrowing troops from an ally? That's even worse. If they win for you, you are now completely at their mercy. The lesson is crystal clear. True power has to rest on your own forces, on citizens who have a real stake in defending their own home. This intense focus on reality over ideals leads us straight to his most controversial ideas. This is where Machiavelli dives deep into the psychology of power, arguing that what a leader appears to be is often way more important than what they actually are. It's the classic question, right? Is it better to be loved or feared? Machiavelli's answer is chillingly clear. Ideally, you want to be both. But since that's really hard to pull off, it is much, much safer to be feared. Why? Because love, he says, is fickle. It's a bond that self-interested people will break whenever it benefits them. Fear, on the other hand, fear is maintained by the threat of punishment, and that's a motivator that never fails. The leader controls fear, they don't control love. But, and this is a huge but, there's a crucial limit to using fear. A prince must be feared, but he must never be hated. And what's the quickest way to be hated? Taking people's stuff. This quote, wow. It's one of the most cynical and insightful lines in the whole book. It suggests our economic security is a more powerful motivator than even our family bonds. A prince can execute a rival, but he should never, ever touch his subjects' property. So how is a prince supposed to navigate this incredibly dangerous world? Machiavelli says he has to be like two animals at once, the lion and the fox. The lion represents brute force, strong enough to scare off the wolves. But the lion isn't smart enough to see the traps. That's where the fox comes in. The fox is cunning, sly, able to recognize snares and outwit enemies. A leader who is only a lion will eventually get trapped. A leader who is only a fox will be overpowered. A successful prince has to be both.
And this cunning nature extends to something like honesty. Let's say a promise you made now threatens the safety of your state. Should you keep it? Machiavelli says absolutely not. And his justification is brutal. Because other people are not good and will break their promises to you, you are under no obligation to keep your promises to them. In a world of backstabbers, pragmatism is just survival. So this all leads to the central strategy of this whole section. You have to separate public virtue from private action. A prince has to cultivate an image of being merciful, trustworthy, and religious. People judge by what they see, right? But behind that virtuous mask, the prince must have a mind that is ready to be cruel, faithless, and ruthless the second the survival of the state demands it. But can a leader, no matter how clever or forceful they are, truly control their own destiny? Machiavelli's answer lies in his struggle with what he called fortune, what we would just call luck. Now, Machiavelli wasn't a fatalist. He didn't believe everything was just predetermined. Instead, he proposed this really fascinating 50-50 split. He argued that fortune, all the unpredictable currents of luck and circumstance, controls about half of our lives. But the other half? That's governed by our own free will, our skill, our preparation, what he called virtue. So you can't control when the river floods, but you can build dams and levees. Okay, this is a very provocative metaphor for sure, but it reveals his core belief about how you deal with luck. Fortune, he says, favors the bold. Cautious, hesitant leaders, they get swept away by her whims. But the impulsive, adventurous leader who acts decisively, that's the one who can impose his will on circumstance. It's better to be audacious and risk failure than to be timid and be guaranteed to be fortune's victim. After 25 chapters of cold, hard, ruthless analysis, the tone of The Prince just completely changes. And to truly understand this book, you have to read the conclusion, because it reframes everything that came before it. Seriously, the last chapter is not a clinical analysis. It is a fiery, patriotic sermon. Machiavelli looks at his homeland, broken, overrun by foreign armies, and he makes this desperate plea. He calls for a new leader to use the ruthless methods he's described for a noble purpose, to forge an army, drive out the invaders, and restore Italian pride and unity. He ends the entire book not with his own words, but with a quote from the poet Petrarch. It's a call to arms, an appeal to the ancient Roman valor that he believes still lies dormant in the Italian people. This final emotional plea suggests that maybe the amoral tactics in The Prince were not an end in themselves, but a necessary evil to achieve a glorious, patriotic goal. So what does this ruthless, 500-year-old playbook teach us today? Well, it's a masterclass in pragmatism. It teaches you to rely on your own strength, not to depend on others. To understand that fear is a more reliable tool than love, but to avoid being hated at all costs. It's about being both the lion and the fox, mastering force and cunning. It's about realizing public perception is a powerful tool. And finally, it's about acting boldly to make your own luck. Ultimately, The Prince forces all of us to confront this really uncomfortable question that is just as relevant today as it was 500 years ago. In the quest for security, for success, for what we believe is the greater good, where do we draw the line? At what point does the pragmatic choice, the so-called necessary evil, just become evil? That's the challenge Machiavelli leaves with us.